News of the Times. Found headless on the marshes. The 1865 crime that haunts Plaistow. Welcome to News of the Times and to a chilling entry into our Scotland Yard casebook. In the winter fog of 1865, a group of working men stumbled upon a scene so disturbing it would haunt Plaistow Marsh for decades. A headless body, mutilated and discarded among the reeds, hands gnawed to the bone, likely by rats, a severed head buried in a shallow hole near a bed of manglewurzels. The crime was so brutal, so deliberately disfiguring, that police initially feared the man could never be identified. But behind the violence lay something more insidious: betrayal, deception, and a calculated plan that reached all the way back to the victim's homeland. And when Scotland Yard stepped in, the full horror of the case began to unravel, leading to one of the most cold-blooded arrests of the decade. This is the 1865 Plaistow Marsh murder, a Victorian beheading designed to erase a man completely. And in today's end of episode further particulars segment, the waltz was elegant, the lighting atmospheric, then Siegfried in full ghostly armour floated across the ballroom ceiling and the conductor nearly fainted into the timpani. Just another enchanted evening at Covent Garden in this ghostly Victorian tale. And now, a brief plea from the spectral depths of the YouTube crypt. If tonight's tale of headless horror and ballroom phantoms sounds like your cup of tea, do consider liking, subscribing, hyping and sharing with the living. It feeds the algorithm, which, much like Dracula, grows stronger with every click and faintly prefers blood-soaked Victorian content. Beware. Those who don't engage may be forever haunted by mediocre recommendations and ghostly toenail care tutorials. You have been warned. So, dim the lights, draw the curtains tight, and settle in with something suitably flammable. The marshes are calling, and the headless do not like to be kept waiting. Sit back, if you dare, and enjoy the show. Background. Ferdinand Edward Carl Cole. Ferdinand Cole was a 27-year-old Prussian by birth, although he spent much of his youth in Hanover, where his father still resided. Stocky, muscular, and described as heavy-set in both build and manner, Cole had arrived in England only months before the crime, in February of that same year. Rumours swirled that he had not left Germany entirely by choice. Papers found on his person suggested he had fled after being sentenced to a heavy penalty for a violent assault. Settling first among the German-speaking communities of Whitechapel, Cole eventually found employment in Plaistow, tending to the horses of a local butcher. It was here he met Hannah, a young Englishwoman of just 18, from a respectable working-class family in the area. The two were married barely 5 weeks before Cole stood accused of murder. Throughout the proceedings, Cole showed little emotion. He spoke broken English and reportedly appeared indifferent to the seriousness of the charge against him. His wife, by contrast, was visibly distraught, a newlywed girl in a public court, overwhelmed by scandal, suspicion, and the collapse of a life just begun. Theodore Christian Furhop, known only as John to those he met in London, the victim of this case, was later identified as Theodor Christian Verhoep, a well-regarded associate of the Hamburg firm Neumann and Buhler. Described as good-looking and in his 30s, Verhoep spoke little English and relied heavily on his companion Ferdinand Cole to navigate his new surroundings. Verhoep was brought over from Germany by Cole himself, who told locals that the man had 200 a year and plans to emigrate to New York. For 13 days, he lodged with Mrs. Warren, the same landlady who had previously housed Cole, and during this time entrusted her with 6 sovereigns, a silver watch, and a gold chain and a ring, all of which hinted at a man of means, but also of vulnerability. Despite living in the area for weeks, no one knew his real name until after his death. He was simply John, a quiet foreigner who kept himself to himself, likely isolated by a language and unaware that he may have been brought to England not for opportunity, but for slaughter. Whether this was a calculated trap from the start to lure a man away from his homeland, strip him of identity and erase him, remains a haunting question. But the facts are grim. The man who arrived in London under the care of a fellow countryman was never again seen alive. The crime. On a grey afternoon in Plaistow Marsh, a group of working men out shooting stumbled upon a human trunk, headless, half hidden amongst the reeds. The flesh around the neck had been hacked in haste, the cuts uneven, the bones twice struck before the vertebrae gave way. The surrounding ditch told the rest of the story. Boot prints, blood, drag marks, and some distance away a circular patch of crimson where the severed head appeared to have been laid for a moment before being carried off and buried in a shallow hole. At first it seemed an attempt to erase a man's identity, to reduce him to an unrecognisable body in the mud. But later investigation by Scotland Yard would suggest something even darker, that the victim had been shot from behind by someone he trusted, and that the mutilation came after. A murder, not of rage, but of calculation, and one that began, as so many do, with a misplaced faith in a familiar face. From the Bristol Mercury, the 12th of November, 1864, shocking murder near London. On Tuesday afternoon, a frightful murder was discovered to have been committed in the Plaistow Marshes. It appears that while a party of working men were amusing themselves by shooting, a youth named Dixon, who was of the company, shot a small bird, and while endeavouring to find it, he stumbled upon the dead body of a man. He instantly gave an alarm and drew his companions to the spot, where they discovered the trunk of a human being had been decapitated. An alarm was immediately conveyed to the police, and they promptly attended. The body was then examined, when it appeared evident that a brutal murder had been committed, and that the head had been severed from the body with a sharp instrument, but manifestly by one that was not able to separate the vertebrae. This was shown by the fact that a sudden chop had been made, falling upon the bone, but had only penetrated impartially, and by the side of the wound it was quite plain that another and a more vigorous blow had been made, cutting entirely through the bone, dividing the marrow of the spinal cord, and so severing the head from the body. Where the body lay, some small pieces of bone and other human integuments were found. It was also observed that the fleshy parts of the neck were frightfully haggled, as if they had been cut in a very hurried manner. The flesh of the hands of the deceased man had been eaten away to the bone, probably by rats. The body was dressed in blue cloth trousers of fine quality, light foreign-made Wellington boots and blue socks. A portion of the shirt which the deceased wore was found upon him, but torn in such a manner as to lead to the belief that the unfortunate deceased had made a vigorous defence. During the latter part of the day, vast numbers of persons attended at the hotel in order to identify, if possible, the body of the deceased. There was one man who spoke tolerably confidently as to his identity, and that was a Mr. Charles Cole of number 4 Hoyst Street in Plaistow. He stated that he believed the deceased man had been formerly his lodger, and that when he came to him he had a great deal of money and clothes, but that he'd spent the former and made away with the latter in order to supply his necessities. He could not, however, say that he had seen any duplicates for the property so disposed of, nor could he tell how the money of the deceased had been laid out. Late at night, Inspector Nightingale of the Metropolitan Police arrived at the hotel with Mr. and Mrs. Cole, a young man named Henry Lee, and another young man. Upon being conducted to the spot where the body of the murdered man was placed, they at once identified the clothes of the deceased as being those belonging to a former lodger of theirs. To Inspector Nightingale, Cole stated that when the deceased came to him, he had plenty of clothes, but no money. He pawned most of his clothes. Mr. Richardson said that if Cole knew that the deceased had pawned his clothes, he, Cole, must know what had become of the duplicates. Cole said he did not. Mrs. Cole stated positively that the last time she saw the deceased alive was on the morning of the previous Thursday, and Cole corroborated her. After the viewing the body, Mr. and Mrs. Cole, together with another person who had identified the body by the clothes, took their seats in a cab under charge of a constable. Shortly afterwards, an order was brought from Inspector Nightingale to hold the man Cole in charge. The information upon which this order was given was upon that of a young man named Henry Lee, who stated that he last saw the deceased and Cole passing the oil works at Plaistow at about 10 o'clock in the forenoon of Thursday, and that when he went to a home to dinner on that day, Cole was there. Cole said that he had been to London with the deceased and that he had lost him in Ratcliffe Highway. The last time that the deceased had been seen alive was upon the occasion spoken to by the lad Lee. Upon this evidence, Inspector Nightingale ordered the apprehension of the man Cole. With the body identified and suspicions mounting, Inspector Nightingale wasted no time. Henry Lee had seen the two men together on the very morning Cole claimed to have lost him, and when confronted, Cole had no answers, not even for the missing pawn tickets. By the time the carriage reached the station, an order had already been issued. Cole was to be held in custody. And so, under a cloud of growing suspicion, the case moved swiftly to its next chapter, the formal examination before the Stratford Police Court. Examination of the accused. The case was heard at the Stratford Police Court on Wednesday morning. The accused, as stated in the charge sheet, was Frederick Ferdinand Edward Carl Cole of Hay Street, Plaistow, sugar baker, a native of Holland, and Hannah, his wife, an Englishwoman, to whom the male prisoner had only been married about 5 weeks. Cole, who is a dull, heavy-looking man of about 27 years of age, did not pay much attention to the proceedings, but his wife, who did not appear to be above 18 years of age and whose parents, although poor were respectable, residing in Plaistow, was overcome with grief and showed that she accurately felt the position in which she was placed. The court was densely packed. At the inquest, key witnesses began to fill in the gaps. Dr. Morris confirmed what was already feared. The victim had been beheaded with a combination of chopper and knife. Rats had eaten away at the hands and neck. Elizabeth Warren, the landlady, placed the victim in Cole's care. The deceased said to be wealthy, preparing for New York. But it was Henry Lee's eyewitness account that unravelled Cole's tale completely. Mr. Superintendent Howell said he went to Cole's house to make inquiries, and in answer to questions, the male prisoner told him that on Thursday, the 3rd instant, he left home with the deceased in the morning and went to the London dock for the purpose of looking for a ship, but there was no ship there of the kind he wanted. Cole then stated that after leaving the London dock, they, the prisoner and the deceased, went into the upper part of the Commercial Road at about 1 o'clock in the day, and he, the prisoner, proceeded into a sugar bakery there, leaving the young German in the street. That on his return to the street he missed him, and he made search after him but could not find him, and had not seen him since. He afterwards said he had been to Silvertown to see the body found in the reeds, and was not sure if it was that of John, as he had no head, but the trousers were like his. Cole's story of the events surrounding the mysterious disappearance of his lodger is directly contradicted by a youth of 18 who states he had seen both Cole and his lodger, now believed to be the beheaded deceased man, together along the river wall not so far from where the body was found. Henry Lee, a youth about 18, said, "I live at number 2 Hoy Street, Plaistow Marshes. On Thursday morning, the 3rd inst, at about 10 o'clock, I was at work, and I saw the male prisoner and the young man, John, whom I believed to be the deceased, walking along the river wall near the sugar house towards Silvertown. That was in the direction from London. I made a remark to the man who was working with me, and that they were 2 men whom I had seen at Zeitch's, where I lodged. I've not seen the young man since. He had on a dark dress and was of fair complexion. I knew him by sight. I have frequently spoken to the other man, the prisoner, at the bar. From where I saw the deceased and the prisoner to where the body was found is about 4 minutes' walk." The prisoner continued, "I saw the prisoner at 4:30 on the afternoon of the same day, Thursday, and he said to me that the young man was missing. I replied to him, 'I saw you and the young man this morning at about 10 o'clock walking by the river bank.' The prisoner said nothing at all in reply. He afterwards told me that he had gone to London in the morning, that he went to a sugar house and left the young man outside, and when he came out, the young man, meaning the deceased, was gone, and that when he returned home, he found the young man's clothes were not there." The chairman inquired of the police whether the head of the dead man had been found. Mr. Superintendent Howe said that the head had been discovered at 8 o'clock that morning, about 30 yards from where the body was discovered. As word of the brutal discovery spread, the Silvertown district was gripped with a mix of horror and grim fascination. Crowds gathered eager for any detail that might explain the identity of the murdered stranger. Scotland Yard, determined to secure confirmation, began orchestrating a series of public viewings, not only of the clothing but of the mutilated remains, in hopes that someone, anyone, might recognise him or recall seeing a man fitting his description heading toward the marshes. Latest particulars. The murder has caused extraordinary excitement in the neighbourhood of Silvertown. 4,000 persons on Wednesday went to view the body. They were in most instances permitted to see the remains of the deceased, not only to the endeavour to corroborate the identification by means of the clothes, but also to give an opportunity of ascertaining whether any person had seen the deceased walking toward the riverbank through the marshes on the day of the murder. No one, however, had been found who could add anything material to the testimony of the boy Lee against the accused Cole. As police surveyed the scene more carefully, the early assumption that the murder occurred where the body was found began to unravel. A more chilling narrative was taking shape. The North Woolwich Road, running past the Victoria graving dock, lies parallel to the Thames. Between the road and the river sprawls a quarter-mile stretch of marshland, choked with rushes some 7 feet high. Hidden within this tangle, a narrow path, just 18 inches wide, threaded its way towards the riverbank. Halfway down this path, a still narrower track veered left, leading to a deep ditch crossed only with difficulty. It was here, in the thick mud of the ditch's base, that officers made a horrifying discovery: a pool of blood 4 feet long and 1 foot wide. The grim traces told their own story. Boot prints of the victim facing away from the attacker, the telltale marks of a struggle, drag marks through the reeds, a circular patch of blood as if the severed head had been briefly set down before being hidden elsewhere. And upon this spot the body had been dragged some 18 yards through the rushes and left in a small clearing. The head, it appeared, had been buried separately in a shallow grave not far from the water's edge. Scotland Yard now had a murder scene, a path of blood, and a suspect in custody. But the question remained, what had really happened on that marshy road? The murderer there, manifestly with a knife, had dug a hole 12 inches deep and buried the head in it, where it was discovered by some of the Thames police on Wednesday morning. No attempt whatever had been made to conceal the body, doubtless because the assassin considered it needless, as though he thought he had prevented identification when he buried the head. The face of the deceased was that of a good-looking German, apparently 30 or 40 years of age, and the complexion was apparently dark, and the features were well formed and regular. On Thursday morning, a careful examination of the body of the murdered man, now removed to the Bell and Anchor Tavern at Plaistow, was made by the surgeons to whom the duty of carefully inspecting the body and reporting upon its condition had been committed, and the result had been the discovery of a gunshot wound in the head. The two men, the murdered man and alleged murderer, went out together, armed for the destruction of any small birds they might meet with, and there seems to be little doubt that on arriving in the unfrequented fields where the body was found, the murderer, whoever he was, allowed his victim to go on first, and then, seizing the first available opportunity, shot his victim through the head. It would seem from the examination made that it was a clumsy shot, and that it took no immediate effect, insomuch as there were traces, not to be mistaken, of a terrible struggle between the murderer and the deceased. On Thursday, the police proceeded to the scene of the murder to make further searches, and no trace, if possible, The weapon with which the murder was committed, they found that the rushes or reeds had been trodden down, but marks of blood were still visible on the surface of the mud and in the water where the deceased was killed. Upon beating about the tall weeds, they discovered a shovel and the wooden handle of a hatchet at about 12 inches in length, which was saturated with water, and there were still marks of blood upon him. The officers then proceeded to the bank or long pathway that leads from the marsh, where there is a stile over which the murderer must have passed after he had committed and disposed of the head. The constables, when they examined the stile, found bloody hand marks on the top rail, which would lead to the inference that the murderer passed over immediately after the committal of the crime and made across the fields to the main road, which was easily reached. The handle of the hatchet and the spade were found within 15 yards of the scene of the murder and about 30 yards from the budget where the head was found. On Thursday night, the coroner opened the formal inquest, and the mystery had already gripped the district. A large crowd gathered, eager to learn what Scotland Yard had uncovered. Though much of the evidence mirrored that presented before the magistrates, it was hinted that Sergeant Clark of the Metropolitan Detective Department had uncovered further key details, motives and circumstances too sensitive for now to be made public. What was clear, however, was this: the man known only as John had met a violent end under highly suspicious and deeply unusual conditions, and the case against Cole was far from closed. From the Reynolds newspaper, the 20th of November, 1864, the Plaistow murder. On Thursday, at the Bell and Anchor Tavern in Plaistow, the adjourned inquest was held before Mr. O.C. Lewis, the coroner for Essex, upon the mutilated body found on Tuesday week in Plaistow Marshes. Mr. Superintendent Howie of the K Division conducted the case on behalf of the police commissioners. The evidence adduced on the previous inquiry may be briefly recapitulated. At the inquest, earlier threads of testimony coalesced into a damning narrative. Josiah Gaster described the grim discovery of the headless corpse during a lunchtime shoot on Silvertown Marshes. Police Sergeant Bridgeland confirmed finding a hammer nearby. Inspector Good later unearthed the severed head just 44 yards away, shallowly buried beneath the reeds. German shoemaker Henry Zulch said Cole claimed his lodger had vanished in London, but Zulch's apprentice Henry Lee directly contradicted him, having seen both men walking together toward the marsh that very morning. Dr. Morris gave clinical confirmation of murder, repeated blows, some from a blunt instrument and others sharp, inflicting while the victim still lived. Mrs. Warren, the landlady, confirmed that the deceased had left with valuables, clothes, money and jewellery, all of which Cole had seen. By now, the victim had a name, a past, and a witness trail that led directly to Carl Cole. The new statement of Mary Wade, a neighbour and fellow lodger of the Coles, would be quietly devastating. The fresh evidence taken was as follows. Mary Wade, a married woman of number 4 Hoy Street, deposed, "I lodged at the house of Cole for 5 weeks previous to the murder, and I lodge there now. The part I occupy is the front parlour, which is near the front door. On the 3rd of November, I saw Cole and the deceased man, who was called John, go out together at about 9:30 in the morning. I had known John ever since I had been there." Mr. Cole came home at about 1 o'clock by himself. He knocked at the door and I let him in. I noticed that there was mud upon him on the legs of his trousers and on the back of his coat and on his elbows. I remarked to him as though he went through the passage, "Good gracious, Charlie, where have you been in all that mud?" He said he had been in a butcher's cart and got it and went out into the backyard and brushed his clothes with a brush which he had got out of a coal cupboard. I possessed a chopper, the weapon now produced. This was an instrument of a formidable character, one side forming an axe and the other a hammer, mounted on a handle about 2 feet long. I had it for about 15 months, and when Cole did not have it, I kept it in a cupboard. I cannot be recollected where he borrowed it last, but I remember him returning it on the Friday after the young man was missing. It was borrowed of me by Cole within 2 or 3 days of John being missing. He came and asked me for it on the occasion to which I refer, and I gave it to him out of the cupboard. The Friday when it was returned was the 4th of November, when Cole gave it to me on my asking him for it. He took it off the fender, and it was not in the same state when he returned it as when I lent it. The handle was painted red. I remarked that it was painted, and he said the handle was loose and that he had painted it to keep it on. That paint was not on when I lent it to Cole and was on when it was returned. Thomas William Hudson, a local man from Plaistow, testified that on the morning of the 3rd of November he had seen Cole and the deceased walking together along the riverbank, leading directly toward the reed bed where the body would later be found. Hudson, who knew both men by sight, passed them at close range and positively identified the deceased as the man later found murdered. John Atkinson, a working engineer from North Woolwich, testified that while walking through Plaistow Marsh a week after the murder, he discovered a white-handled clasp knife lying between the sites where the head and body had been found. Upon opening it at home, his wife noticed what appeared to be hairs clinging to the back of the blade. Atkinson promptly turned the knife over to the police, and its location was later confirmed by Sergeant Bridgeland, approximately 20 yards from each of the discovery points. Joseph Eccleden, a labourer and cousin to Mrs. Cole, testified that on the Friday following the disappearance, Cole invited him to help open 2 locked boxes belonging to the missing man. Cole broke them open, claiming John had gone to London and would not return. Inside were a few personal items, a pair of trousers, a shirt, some collars, and notably a white-handled knife. Detective Sergeant George Clark testified that during a search of Cole's house on the 9th of November, multiple pawn tickets were discovered, several in the name of John Cole, others under aliases like Williams and Burrup and Schooled. These tickets related to clothing and personal items, including shirts, petticoats, a ring and a shawl, all pawned in October for small sums. The implication was damning. The belongings of the murdered man had been quietly liquidated, and Cole appeared to have access to them. A pistol, ammunition, and a chopper, previously returned by Mary Wade, were also recovered. The re-examination of the prisoner. Yesterday, Ferdinand Edward Carl Cole was brought up for further examination at Ilford Jail before Mr. H. Ford Barclay, chairman, Mr. J. Cooper Davis, Major Stewart, and Mr. J. Raymond Pelly, the presiding magistrates. The court was densely crowded long before the examination was resumed. The prisoner, having been placed at the bar in the custody of Superintendent Howie of K Division, who, as well as Inspector Nightingale of the K Division of Police and Mr. Sergeant Clark of the Detective Department from Scotland Yard, was present to prosecute the case. Upon the assembling of the court, Mr. Gifford rose and said he appeared for the prosecution and requested that the depositions of Superintendent Howie should be read. The prisoner, a man of short stature but of strong muscular frame, and who appeared totally indifferent to the serious charge preferred against him, was then removed from the deck. Some very strict inquiries had been instituted both in this country and abroad as to the character of the prisoner Cole, and some curious facts had been elicited. From papers found in Cole's possession, it would appear that he is a Prussian by birth, having been baptized and vaccinated in Prussia, but his family removed while he was young to Hanover, where his father is still living. Cole first came to England in February last, and it is said that he came here a fugitive from justice. For having committed a violent assault, he was adjudged to pay a heavy penalty, which he avoided by fleeing the country. When here he first lived amongst the Germans employed about Whitechapel, but he at length obtained employment at Plaistow to look after a butcher's horses, and while in this capacity he became acquainted with a young woman whom he married. Most, if not all, the articles, the pawn tickets of which were found on the prisoner, belonged to the deceased, and it is expected to be proved that they were pledged by the prisoner, who in some instances gave his own name, which was spelt by the pawnbrokers as pronounced Cole. It is now established beyond question that the deceased is Theodore Christian Verhoep, lately connected with the firm of Neumann and Buller of Hamburg. The coroner then summed up and said that the deceased, after being struck a fearful blow on the back of the head, was then struck other blows with an excess of cruelty and violence. The only remaining question to be dealt with was by whom were those blows struck. The very day after the deceased went to lodge with Cole, the pawning of his property began, although the evidence showed that he was then possessed of £4 10s in money. The pawning continued until nearly all his property was gone. After the deceased was murdered on the Thursday, Cole said he believed the deceased would never come back, and he broke into his boxes and remarked that all the things were nearly gone. Why should Cole have believed that the man he walked out with towards the reed bed that morning would never come back? However, he found in the box a knife which he had missed. That knife was afterwards found between the spot where the head was buried and the body was left. The person that had the knife was therefore down at that spot for some purpose subsequent to the murder, doubtless on the Monday. Without doubt, the murderer went back on that morning to dismember the body of the deceased. The blood on the prisoner's clothes and all the other circumstances, which it was hardly necessary to dwell upon, made out at all events a case quite strong enough to justify sending the prisoner to trial. The jury, after a brief consultation, returned a verdict of wilful murder against Ferdinand Edward Carl Cole for killing and slaying Beden Christina Verhoef, a merchant's clerk. From the Reynolds newspaper, the 15th of January 1865, the murder of a foreigner at Plaistow. Ferdinand Edward Carl Cole was indicted at the Old Bailey for the murder of his countryman John Q. Christian Verhoep. The prisoner pleaded not guilty and demanded a mixed jury of English and foreigners. M. Albert was engaged by the Crown as an interpreter. The prisoner is 26 years of age and was described as a sugar baker. He is a short, thick-set man with dark brown hair and somewhat florid complexion. When asked to plead, he replied, "Not guilty," in an emphatic tone of voice and speaking in English. He folded his arms on the front of the dock and listened with intense interest to the opening statement of the Solicitor General, at parts of which he smiled. At times during the day his manner was unbecoming, and he appeared to have no adequate sense of the peril in which he stood. He sat octagonally, but was chiefly occupied in writing notes to his solicitor on bits of paper. Once he reeled back in his chair and appeared to be fainting, but only for a moment, and he soon recovered his composure, and at other times he sprang to his feet, as on the production of the knife, and listened attentively to the evidence. The Solicitor General briefly stated that the substance of the evidence he intended to adduce in support of the charge. The prisoner was a German and had been engaged as a sugar baker. At about the middle of September he went to Germany and returned to England on the 2nd of October. He met with a young woman whom he was married, and he took a house in Hoy Street, Plaistow Marshes, the rent of which he endeavoured to pay by letting out part of it in lodging. From Germany he brought with him a young man named Furhop, and introduced him to Mrs. Warren, with whom the prisoner had previously lodged. He took lodgings at her house and afterwards went to live with the prisoner, remaining with him up to the time of his death. He should prove that this young man was foully murdered. On the 8th of November, the body was found in a reed field by the side of the river, the head being cut off. The clothes were stripped off, with the exception of the boots and trousers, and there was nothing to indicate that a struggle had taken place. Probably the deceased was struck down at once, but he would not enlarge upon the point, for he presumed it would not be contended that the deceased had committed suicide. The learned gentleman then proceeded to consider the evidence tending to the conclusion that the prisoner was the murderer, tracing the movements of the prisoner and the deceased in company together, and the movements of the prisoner after the deceased disappeared. He commented on the fact that the prisoner gave a false account of his conduct and had stated that on the day of the murder he was at a sugar bakery at Whitechapel, whereas it would be proved that he was on Plaistow Marshes, where the body was found. The clothes of the prisoner had been submitted to Dr. Letherby, who had found spots of blood on them. He had also inspected a chopper with which had been in the prisoner's possession, and he had found upon it small portions of cotton linen fibre and also a very small portion of human skin. A knife would be produced, which was found upon the spot, with human hair adhering to it, and this knife, it would be proved, was the property of the prisoner. The trial. The prosecution presented a tightly woven case built on eyewitness accounts, forensic testimony, and damning circumstantial evidence, including the discovery of pawn tickets, the victim's belongings, and blood-stained weapons tied to coal. The defence offered an impassioned plea for reasonable doubt, pointing to the lack of direct eyewitnesses to the murder and suggesting Cole's explanations were consistent. The judge's directions and deliberations. In his summing up, the Lord Chief Baron advised the jury not to fixate on any single element, but to weigh the case as a whole, reminding them that while circumstantial evidence may lack certainty, it rarely lies. After deliberating for some time, the jury requested the distance between the reed bed, the London docks, and the commercial road, questioning whether the route Cole claimed to have taken matched the time frame. A surveyor estimated the distance at nearly 5 miles. The jury soon returned with their verdict. After an absence of 35 minutes, the clerk of the arraigns, amidst breathless silence, said, "Gentlemen of the jury, are you agreed?" The foreman said, "We are. Do you find the prisoner at the bar guilty or not guilty?" The foreman then said, "Guilty." "Is that the verdict of you all?" "Yes." The clerk of the arraigns to the prisoner, "You have been found guilty of murder. Have you anything to say why sentence of death should not be passed upon you?" The prisoner made no reply, but appeared much agitated. Mr. Justice Blackburn then assumed the black cap and, addressing the prisoner, said, "Prisoner at the bar, after a careful trial, you have been found guilty of the offence of murder upon evidence which justified the jury and coming to such a conclusion. It is no part of my duty to say anything beyond passing upon you the sentence of the court, and in doing so I would impress on you that you have no reason whatever to hope for mercy in this world." He then passed sentence of death in the usual manner, and the prisoner was removed from the dock. He was handed over to the custody of the Sheriff of Essex and will be hanged at Chelmsford. In the weeks before the execution, while awaiting his fate in Chelmsford's Springfield jail, Charles Cole remained composed and resolute. He spent his final weeks reading and writing, receiving frequent visits from the prison chaplain. Although attentive to the chaplain's words, Cole continued to protest his innocence with passionate intensity, insisting he was as white as snow. Jail officials described him as a man of steely determination, the sort who, if he were ever to confess, would do so only at the very last moment. From the Reynolds newspaper, the 29th of January, 1865, the execution of Cole. Ferdinand Edward Carl Cole was executed at 9 o'clock on Thursday morning at Chelmsford Jail for the murder of Theodore Christian Vorholt on the 3rd of November last at Plaistow Marshes. Cole, when sentenced to death was passed upon him, was impressively warned that there was no hope for him in this world. This being so, Captain McGorry, during the time Cole was in his charge, did not lose an opportunity of assuring him that no efforts were being made for a respite, and a further of impressing upon him the fact that the sentence of the law would most assuredly be carried out, believing that if he could once get him to accept the fact, it might be the means of inducing him to confess. The laudable effort, however, of this gentleman proved entirely fruitless, for all along the prisoner strenuously protested his innocence, and when pushed to tell the truth, would indignantly and violently repudiate the charge. He argued that if he had been guilty, he should have left the country. During the afternoon of Wednesday, he frequently referred to the false evidence that had been adduced against him, and at intervals flew into violent passions, repeating the words, "My heart and hands are as white as snow." Dr. Capel visited the wretched man at 6 o'clock on Wednesday night and remained with him till 8:30. During this interview, the prisoner, when exhorted by the reverend gentleman to make a confession of his crime, became very violent, emphatically protesting his innocence, reiterating, "My heart and hands are as white as snow." At times in this interval, the violence of the prisoner was so excessive that not alone was it deemed expedient by the governor, but Dr. Capel requested that a couple of warders should remain in the cell with him in case the prisoner assaulted him. Toward the end of the interview, however, the prisoner became calmer, and then one of the warders was allowed to withdraw from the cell and keep watch outside. At 6:30, Dr. Capel again visited the wretched man, and after warning him of his fast approaching end, exhorted him to confess his guilt. This he vehemently refused to do. He also referred to some of the witnesses who appeared against him on his trial, declaring that they had perjured themselves, and spoke in terms of great regret that his solicitor failed to call witnesses for his defence, or they, he said, would have proved him innocent. Shortly before 8 o'clock he went down and partook of some breakfast, and appeared comparatively cheerful. Having finished his meal, he got up and walked hurriedly about his cell. He was then so violent that the under-sheriff felt himself compelled to direct that handcuffs should be placed upon him to prevent him from doing a mischief to himself or those about him. But before this was done, however, the prisoner had thrown himself violently upon the floor and had also attempted to knock his head violently against the wall, and his conduct was such that it was deemed prudent to keep the handcuffs on him until the execution took place. Then he went on to protest his innocence, and finally became very excited and fainted, falling upon his back. Restoratives were applied, and with the assistance of some 6 warders, he was raised and placed upon his feet. Upon recovering self-possession, he again became violent, and seizing a pen with which he had been writing, tried to thrust it down his throat. He, however, was prevented doing this, but as it was, a portion of the pen penetrated the roof of his mouth. It evidently produced much pain, and he asked to have it taken out, but as it is wanted but a few minutes to 9 o'clock, the warders refused to do so. The mournful procession, consisting of the sheriff, the under-sheriff, Dr. Capel, and the Reverend Mr. Hamilton, and the governor of the jail, and led off by the wretched men and Calcraft, who walked by his side, they moved slowly to the press room. Here Cole was pinioned. During the procession the prisoner trembled violently and looked deadly pale, and in answer to the unceasing exhortations of Dr. Capel, firmly and emphatically protested his innocence. Some 2 minutes before 9 o'clock, the solemn knell of the prison bell indicated the approach of the prisoner to the scaffold, and a minute afterwards he appeared under the fatal drop, which was erected over the prison gate. Here some slight delays took place, as he appeared as if he wished to turn his back to the people and turn different ways before he was in the proper position to have the rope adjusted. As soon as the rope was around his neck, he began to pray in German very loudly, uttering emphatically at the last moment, "I die an innocent man, so help my God and Jesus." The wretched man was then launched into eternity amidst a shudder of horror of the assembled multitude. He struggled for some considerable time and appeared to die very hard. His body, after hanging till 10 o'clock, was put down and buried within the precincts of the prison. The multitude, although by no means vast, then quietly dispersed, leaving behind only silence and a scaffold that had struggled to swallow the truth. Further particulars. As all good soirees should, this one began with a waltz, 1,000 glittering lights, and only a modest chance of spectral interruption. But what the dancers at Covent Garden received was no ordinary haunting, no moaning chain clanker skulking in the wings, no pale lady drifting mournfully past the cloakroom. No, what they got was a fully armoured figure in the style of Wagner's Siegfried, floating boldly across the dance floor like a Teutonic hovercraft on its way to the afterlife's stage door. From the Ottawa Citizen, the 20th of December, 1930, Ghost floating over the heads of gay dancers. A ghost floating over the heads of 1,000 dancers at Covent Garden Opera House one night recently brought the music to an abrupt stop, while Mr. Herman Dowiski, the conductor, sank into a chair, horrified, with the baton slipping from his fingers. The light had been subdued for a waltz, and a rotating ball of mirrors in the centre of the hall cast 1,000 shimmering spots of light on the ceiling, walls, and floor. A ghostly figure in armour resembling Wagner's Siegfried suddenly emerged from the solid wall opposite the band, declared Mr. Dowinski, and it floated just over the heads of the dancers right across the hall in the direction of the stage door, and then faded mysteriously into nothing. It is my custom, while conducting my band, to turn from side to side to watch the dancers. We had almost finished playing the waltz when I noticed my drummer had ceased to play and was staring fixedly with a look of horror across the hall. I glanced round and saw what for a moment I thought was a patch of light from the revolving ball. I bent forward and saw that it was a clearly defined figure of a man, helmeted and in armour, which was moving slowly, immediately, over the heads of the dancers. I was so dumbfounded that I scarcely noticed that my band had stopped. The dancers stared in amazement around them, wondering what had happened. A member ran over to me, thinking that I had been taken suddenly ill, and at that moment the floating figure, which now had always reached the stage door, faded away. I felt weak from shock. Members of the band crowded around, and two of them told me that they too had seen the armoured figure pass through the hall. Mr. Dowiski wiped his forehead and added, "Even now I can scarcely speak calmly about what I saw. I'm still shaken and unnerved, and I am still fearful that the apparition may prove to be an omen of tragedy. It was lucky that the dancers were looking at me when the music stopped and not at the back of the hall. I fear that if they had seen what I saw, there would have been a panic." It has been a common rumour for more than 100 years that Covent Garden Theatre is haunted. The ghost of Richard Brinsley Sheridan, whose Rivals and other famous plays were produced there, has from time to time been met with in various parts of the older portions of the structure. The appearance of Sheridan has been said to coincide with some incident of importance, and a former Duke of Bedford, who was a freeholder of the theatre, always dreaded to hear that Sheridan had been seen. Other London theatres which are supposed to have been haunted include Drury Lane, where the ghost of the famous Dan Leno was seen by Stanley Lupino, the comedian, many years after Leno's death. The Haymarket Theatre, where the ghost of the late J.C. Buxton is stated to have been seen on more than one occasion. and the Royalty Theatre, which is said at times to be visited by the ghost of a white lady. We hope you enjoyed the episode. If so, please consider aiding us in our eternal battle against the shadowy nemesis of small channels, the algorithm. You can strike a blow by liking, subscribing and commenting or hyping us, whether with a click or a moderately interpretive dance. We don't judge. Sharing with a sentient being or even a particularly clever houseplant also helps. All of this nudges us out of the virtual broom cupboard where we've been quietly placed, and it sends News of the Times boldly forth into chartless hands, or at least slightly further up the recommended feed. Fancy going one step further? You can support our work and mildly confuse your accountant by joining us on Patreon for just £5 a month. After a 7-day free trial, you'll unlock every News of the Times episode ad-free and 24 hours early, access to the full archive of historical crimes and scandals, over 740 episodes, every single Robin & Co. story exclusive to Patreon, exclusive historical documentaries, and the warm glow of knowing that you're helping fund future true crime historical content and a weak stab at British humour. Even better, every new member causes a celebrity ruckus amongst our marsupial back office team at Patreon HQ. Tiny creatures in waistcoats leap off their hamster wheels to perform joyful high fives with their teensy paws before filling your name in a very tiny mahogany drawer under Delightful Humans. Join us at News of the Times Historical Crime at patreon.com, or risk being pelted gently with Victorian bonnet pins by the ghost of Great Aunt Edna. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, curator of scandals, steward of sideburns, and the last man in England still tipping his hat to telegraph poles.